The sun over the rolling hills of Blackwood County didn't just shine, it bore down with a weight that felt personal. In the summer of 1994, the air was a thick curtain of heat and humidity that made every breath feel like a chore. Most men in the county spent their mornings at the local diner complaining about the price of diesel and the lack of rain, but Marcus Henderson was different. Marcus was 52 years old with hands that looked like they were carved from hickory and eyes that seemed to be looking at something 5 miles past the horizon. While the rest of the town was bracing for a dry spell, Marcus was out in his north pasture with a shovel and a pile of terracotta pipes that looked like they belonged in a museum rather than a modern farm. Old Man Miller pulled his truck over to the side of the gravel road one Tuesday morning, watching as Marcus wiped sweat from his forehead. Miller leaned out the window and spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. He asked Marcus what in the world he was doing burying perfectly good pipe in a field that hadn't seen a decent crop in 3 years. Marcus didn't even look up from his trench. He just said he was planting the water. Miller laughed so hard he nearly choked on his chew, telling Marcus that water doesn't grow and that he was wasting his time digging his own grave 1 foot at a time. The neighbors began to call it Henderson's folly. They would drive by and slow down just to catch a glimpse of the man who thought he could outsmart the clouds by putting clay in the dirt. The community of Blackwood was built on tradition and hard work, but it was also built on a certain kind of stubbornness. If a tractor didn't fix it, then it wasn't worth fixing. If the rain didn't fall, you just waited and prayed. To see Marcus Henderson out there day after day measuring the slope of the land with a laser level and a piece of string was an affront to their way of life. They saw the precision as arrogance. Silas Thorne, the local hardware store owner, told everyone at the Sunday market that Marcus had finally let the isolation of the high ridge get to his head. Silas said that a man who spends more time talking to the soil than his neighbors is bound to lose his way. He could have used a traditional irrigation rig. He could have invested in a deep well pump that would roar through the night. He could have just planted corn like everyone else and hoped for the best, but he didn't. Marcus knew what they were saying, but he didn't care because he was looking at the world through the lens of physics and history. He had spent his younger years traveling through the dry regions of the Mediterranean and North Africa as a geological consultant. He had seen systems that were thousands of years old still flowing with cool water while modern steel pumps nearby sat rusted and broken. He remembered a specific valley in the Atlas Mountains where a village used nothing but the pull of the earth to move water from a distant spring into a series of underground chambers. That memory stayed with him like a seed waiting for the right conditions to sprout. When he inherited the family farm in Blackwood, he realized the land was tired. The topsoil was thin, and the traditional way of farming was stripping away what little moisture remained. He spent nearly 2 years researching the specific clay compositions of the region. He needed pipes that were porous enough to breathe, but strong enough to withstand the pressure of 3 feet of earth. He wasn't just looking for pipes, he was looking for a biological interface. He studied the works of ancient engineers and combined that knowledge with modern fluid dynamics. He calculated that with a grade of exactly 1/5%, he could move water through a closed loop using nothing more than the natural atmospheric pressure and the cooling effect of the deep earth. His plan involved a 3,000-gallon cistern buried at the highest point of the property, which would act as the heart of the system. The preparation was grueling. Marcus spent his nights at a small oak desk covered in topographical maps and notebooks filled with complex equations. He calculated the transpiration rates of heirloom tomatoes and peppers, comparing them to the moisture retention capacity of the silt loam soil. He knew that if he buried the pipes at 18 inches, they would be below the frost line but within the primary root zone of his crops. He was planning a subterranean network that would act like a giant sponge. While his neighbors were busy polishing their tractors, Marcus was busy learning the language of the earth. He was obsessed with the idea of a silent harvest, a system that required no fuel, no electricity, and no constant maintenance. The construction phase began in early April just as the ground was beginning to thaw. Marcus didn't hire a crew. He didn't want the noise or the questions. He used a small vintage trenching attachment on his old Massey Ferguson, but the final shaping of the ditches was done by hand. Every foot of the 2-mile network had to be perfect. He used a mix of coarse river gravel and fine sand to create a bedding for the pipes. This wasn't just for support, it was for drainage and to prevent the heavy clay soil from clogging the pores of the terracotta. He would lay a section of pipe, then check the level, then lay another. It was slow, tedious work that left his back aching and his hands blistered. By the third week of the build, the skeptics were out in force. The local coffee shop was buzzing with theories about what Henderson was actually doing. Some said he was building an underground bunker because he was afraid of a coming war. Others joked that he was trying to hide a stash of gold. Silas Thorne stopped by again, this time bringing a few other men from the Grange. They watched as Marcus carefully sealed a joint with a mixture of natural resin and beeswax. Silas asked if Marcus was planning on growing molehills, since that seemed to be the only thing he was disturbing. Marcus just smiled and told them that when the heat came, he would be the only one with green leaves. The men walked away shaking their heads, convinced that Marcus was throwing his life savings into a hole in the ground. The technical challenges were constant. In the second month, Marcus hit a vein of solid granite that wasn't on any of the old surveys. It sat right in the path of the main artery of his system. He could have gone around it, but that would have ruined the grade. He could have used explosives, but that might have cracked the pipes he had already laid. Instead, he spent 10 days with a jackhammer and a set of chisels working inch by inch to carve a channel through the stone. It was a test of will that nearly broke him. One afternoon, the temperature spiked to 90 degrees and the dust was so thick he could taste it. He sat in the trench holding a broken chisel and wondered if Miller was right. Maybe he was just a fool chasing a ghost. But then he remembered the dry valleys he had seen and the way the old systems turned dust into gardens. He got back to work. He developed a series of specialized traps made from copper mesh to keep out silt and roots. He designed a pressure-regulating valve that used a simple float made from a hollowed-out cedar block. It was a masterpiece of low-tech engineering. By mid-June, the primary grid was complete. He had buried over 4,000 feet of pipe across 5 acres of hillside. He then focused on the cistern. He lined it with a special lime-based mortar that would naturally purify the water as it sat. He connected the system to a series of hidden collection points along the ridge designed to catch the heavy morning dew and the occasional light rain. As the system neared completion, the weather began to change. The usual afternoon clouds disappeared and the wind began to blow from the southwest, carrying a dry, searing heat from the plains. It was the beginning of what the meteorologists would later call the Great Heartland Sizzle. By July, the grass in Blackwood County had turned the color of a weathered cardboard box. The creeks were slowing to a trickle and the ponds were receding, leaving behind rings of cracked mud. The local water board began to issue restrictions. Farmers were told they could only water their livestock and that irrigation of crops was strictly prohibited to preserve the town's dwindling supply. Marcus, however, was ready. On the 1st of July, he opened the main valve at the base of his cistern. There was no roar of a motor, no vibration of a pump. There was only a faint rhythmic clicking as the cedar float adjusted to the flow. Deep underground, the water began to move. It didn't flood the fields, it didn't spray into the air where it would evaporate in seconds. Instead, it seeped slowly through the walls of the terracotta pipes. The earth around the pipes began to cool and a localized microclimate began to form beneath the surface. Marcus had planted his garden in long, narrow rows directly above the buried lines. While his neighbors watched their corn shrivel and turn brown, Marcus's seedlings began to stretch toward the sun. The community's skepticism turned into a strange kind of resentment. They saw Marcus out in his field every evening, not with a hose, but with a hoe just lightly turning the top inch of soil to break the crust. His plants were a deep, vibrant green that looked almost artificial against the scorched backdrop of the county. Miller drove by and didn't laugh this time. He just stared at the lush rows of squash and tomatoes that were already starting to flower. He couldn't understand how a man could have a garden like that without a single drop of water visible on the surface. The ground looked bone dry, but if you dug down just 2 inches, the soil was cool and moist like a forest floor after a spring rain. The heat intensified. For 22 days straight, the temperature stayed above 100 degrees. The humidity dropped to nearly zero, and the wind felt like it was coming off a blast furnace. In town, the trees were starting to drop their leaves in a desperate bid to survive. The local nursery went out of business, and the grocery store was struggling to get fresh produce. People were grumpy and tired, their nerves frayed by the relentless sun. Every morning, the townspeople would look at the sky searching for a cloud, but the blue was endless and unforgiving. One evening, Silas Thorne walked up Marcus's driveway. He looked older and tired, his shirt stained with sweat. He didn't offer a joke or a snide remark. He just asked Marcus how he was doing it. Marcus took him to the edge of the vegetable patch. He handed Silas a trowel and told him to dig. Silas pushed the blade into the hard-baked earth and was shocked when it slid in easily after the first inch. He pulled up a handful of dark, rich soil that smelled of life and moisture. Silas looked at Marcus and then at the dry hills surrounding them. He asked where the pump was hidden. Marcus told him there was no pump. He explained that the earth itself was the pump and the gravity was the fuel. He showed Silas the vent pipes hidden behind some bushes, which allowed the system to breathe and maintain the correct atmospheric pressure. The realization hit Silas like a physical blow. He had spent thousands of dollars on electricity and fuel trying to keep his small garden alive, and it had died anyway. Here was Marcus using nothing but clay and physics, and his garden was thriving. Word spread quickly. The resentment began to melt away, replaced by a desperate curiosity. People who had mocked Marcus now started showing up at his gate asking for advice. They brought their children to see the magic garden where water flowed uphill and the heat couldn't touch the roots. Marcus didn't turn them away. He didn't gloat or say, "I told you so." He just took them to the trenches and showed them the pipes. He could have kept the secret to himself. He could have sold his produce for 10 times its value and become the richest man in the county. He could have let the others suffer for their mockery, but he didn't. Instead, he began to hold informal workshops in his barn. He sat on an old hay bale and drew diagrams on a chalkboard explaining the principles of capillary action and thermal mass. He told them that the problem wasn't the lack of water, but the way they managed it. He taught them about the 1.5% grade and the importance of the river gravel bedding. He showed them how to make their own terracotta pipes using the local clay deposits. The crisis peaked in August when the main town well began to run dry. The situation was dire. The local hospital was running low on water, and the fire department was worried about the tinder dry woods. Marcus stepped up. He revealed that his cistern system was connected to an even larger underground aquifer he had discovered during his initial research. Because his irrigation system was so efficient, he had a massive surplus of water stored in his buried tanks. He worked with the town council to hook up a temporary gravity feed line that provided enough water to keep the hospital functional and the elder care facility cool. He became the silent savior of a town that had called him a madman. When the rains finally returned in September, they came with a vengeance. A massive thunderstorm dumped for inches of water into hours. For most farmers, this was another disaster as the parched earth couldn't absorb the water, leading to massive erosion and runoff. But Marcus's land was different. His buried pipe network acted as a giant drainage system. The excess water was pulled into the pipes and channeled safely into his storage cisterns and back into the deep soil. While his neighbors were dealing with washed-out roads and ruined topsoil, Marcus's field remained stable and productive. His system had proven itself not just in the drought, but in the flood. In the years that followed, the landscape of Blackwood County began to change. You could see the vent pipes popping up in fields all over the region. The technique became known as the Henderson method. Farmers who were once skeptical now swore by it. They found that their yields increased and their input costs plummeted. More importantly, they felt a new sense of connection to the land. They weren't fighting the weather anymore, they were working with it. Marcus continued to innovate, adding solar-powered sensors to monitor moisture levels, though he always insisted that the basic physics was all you really needed. The legacy of Marcus Henderson wasn't just in the green fields or the full cisterns. It was in the shift in the community's mindset. They learned that innovation often looks like madness before it looks like genius. They learned that the oldest solutions are sometimes the most resilient. Marcus lived to see his grandchildren playing in a garden that never went thirsty. He would sit on his porch in the evenings, watching the shadows lengthen over the rows of pipes he had buried so many years ago. He knew that even after he was gone, the water would keep moving silent and steady beneath the earth. He had proven that a man with a shovel and a dream could change the world 1 foot of clay at a time. The story of the buried pipes became a local legend passed down through generations. It was a reminder that when the world gets loud and the heat becomes unbearable, the best answers are often found deep beneath the surface, waiting for someone with the patience to dig. Marcus Henderson didn't just irrigate a garden, he irrigated the spirit of a community, showing them that true sustainability isn't about power but about balance. As the sun set over Blackwood, the green field stood as a testament to a man who looked at a dry hill and saw a fountain. He could have been forgotten. He could have been just another bitter farmer. He could have lived a quiet, unremarkable life, but he didn't. The journals Marcus kept were not just logs of weather and crop yields, they were a map of a man's obsession with the unseen forces of the earth. His grandfather had left him a leather-bound book from the late 19th century filled with sketches of hand-dug wells and notes on the moisture-wicking properties of different strata of soil. It was in these yellowed pages that Marcus first found the mention of the ancient Roman cisterns and the clay conduits used in the dry reaches of the Levant. He spent years during his engineering career studying the way fluid moves through porous media. He wasn't just a farmer, he was a student of the hydraulic legacy of civilizations that had long since vanished. He knew that the modern reliance on heavy machinery and fossil fuels was a temporary bandage on a wound that was growing deeper with every passing season. He saw the depletion of the Ogallala aquifer not as a distant news story, but as a slow-motion catastrophe that would eventually bring the entire region to its knees. The motivation for the project came during a particularly brutal winter in the late 80s. He had watched as the frost drove deep into the ground, cracking the metal pipes of his neighbors' pressurized systems. He realized then that anything rigid and mechanical was doomed to fail against the raw power of the elements. He wanted something that could breathe and flex, something that functioned more like a root system than a plumbing job. He began his research by collecting soil samples from every corner of his 300 acres. He sent them to labs for mineral analysis, and he conducted his own tests in a small workshop behind the barn. He was looking for the perfect balance of kaolinite and alite in the clay he would use for his own pipes. He built a small kiln using salvage fire bricks and experimented with firing temperatures between 1800 and 2000 degrees Fahrenheit. If the pipe was fired to hot, it became vitrified and waterproof like a dinner plate. If it wasn't hot enough, it would crumble under the weight of the soil. He needed a specific level of porosity that would allow water to sweat through the walls at a rate of precisely 2 gallons per foot every 24 hours. The neighbors saw the smoke rising from his kiln and the piles of rejected pipes, and they took it as a sign of his impending failure. They gathered at the hardware store to discuss the eccentricities of the man on the hill. Miller told the group that Marcus was trying to build a pipe organ for the Worms. They laughed and joked about the sounds the dirt would make when Henderson started playing his subterranean music. Silas Thorne joined in, saying that a man who spends his retirement playing with mud instead of enjoying his pension is a man who has lost his grip on reality. They could have offered to help with a standard irrigation project. They could have shared the cost of a new community well. They could have listened when Marcus tried to explain the math of the vapor pressure deficit. But they didn't. By the spring of the first year of construction, Marcus had mapped out the primary grid. He understood that the land had its own natural rhythm and flow. He used a surveyor's transit to mark the contour lines of the north slope. He spent weeks walking the fields with a set of dowsing rods, not because he believed in magic, but because he understood that the subtle changes in the electrical conductivity of the earth could signal the presence of underground moisture veins. He was looking for the path of least resistance. He planned a central spine that would run from the high ridge down to the valley floor with lateral branches spaced exactly 12 feet apart. This spacing was calculated to ensure that the moisture plumes from each pipe would overlap underground, creating a continuous blanket of hydrated soil without ever wetting the surface. The actual digging was a test of physical and mental endurance that would have broken a younger man. The soil in that part of Blackwood County was a mix of heavy clay and stubborn shale. Marcus worked from dawn until dusk, his muscles screaming and his skin turning the color of old leather. He encountered a layer of blue clay at the 4-foot mark that was so thick it felt like digging through cold beeswax. He had to design a specialized spade with a narrower blade just to cut through it. Every night he would return to the house caked in mud, his hands so cramped he could barely hold a fork. He would sit at the kitchen table and update his charts, noting the exact depth and soil composition of every 10-foot section of trench. He was building a three-dimensional model of his farm in his mind. During the second month of the build, he hit a pocket of quicksand near the old creek bed. It was a setback that threatened to swallow weeks of progress. The trench he had painstakingly carved began to collapse in on itself as the unstable soil liquefied. The neighbors drove by and saw him standing waist deep in a muddy hole, and they pulled over to offer their mock sympathy. Miller asked him if he was digging a swimming pool for the crawfish. Marcus ignored the jab and spent the next 3 days hauling in 3 tons of crushed limestone to stabilize the base of the trench. He learned that the earth is not a static thing, it is a living, moving entity that requires respect and negotiation. He didn't fight the quicksand, he integrated it, using it as a natural filter for the lower section of his network. He began laying the first 1,000 feet of pipe in May. He used a proprietary mix of sand and organic compost to backfill the trenches. This mixture acted as a wick, drawing the water away from the terracotta and distributing it into the surrounding silt. He was meticulous about the joints. He didn't use plastic couplings or rubber seals. Instead, he used a traditional bell and spigot design, sealing each connection with a paste made from natural bitumen and fine-ground clay. This allowed the system to remain flexible as the earth shifted during the change of seasons. He was creating a giant ceramic skeleton for his land. He could have used PVC. He could have used galvanized steel. He could have used high-density polyethylene, but he didn't. As the system grew, the skepticism in town reached a fever pitch. There was a town hall meeting about water rights, and several residents raised concerns that Marcus's underground project was somehow stealing water from the common aquifer. The local water commissioner, a man named Higgins, visited the farm to conduct an inspection. He walked the perimeter with a scowl on his face, looking for illegal pumps or hidden siphons. He found nothing but a series of quiet vents and a very tired man with a shovel. Higgins asked Marcus where the motor was and how he intended to move thousands of gallons of water without a single kilowatt of power. Marcus pointed to the sky and then to the ground and said that the sun provided the energy and the earth provided the path. Higgins left confused but unable to find any violation of the code. The heat of June brought a different kind of challenge. The temperature inside the trenches would climb to over 100 degrees by noon, making the air thick and suffocating. Marcus had to adjust his schedule, waking up at 3 in the morning to work by the light of a headlamp before the sun became a physical weight. He began to see the logic of his own system in the way the morning dew collected on his tools. He designed a series of condenser traps at the top of the ridge. These were large stone-filled chambers that would cool rapidly at night and cause atmospheric moisture to condense and drip into the primary cistern. It was a way of harvesting the air itself. He calculated that on a high humidity night he could collect nearly 50 gallons of water using nothing but the temperature differential between the air and the stones. The technical innovations didn't stop there. He realized that the roots of the crops would eventually find their way to the moist terracotta and potentially clog the pores. To prevent this, he experimented with a light application of copper sulfate on the outer surface of the pipes, which acted as a natural root deterrent without harming the plants or the soil. He also installed a series of clean-out ports every 100 yards. These were vertical pipes that reached the surface, allowing him to drop a small weighted sensor down to check for silt buildup. He was building a maintenance-free system that was designed to last for a century. He was thinking about his grandchildren's grandchildren while his neighbors were thinking about next week's fuel bill. By mid-July, the drought had truly set in. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, and the horizon shimmered with heat haze. The corn in the surrounding fields was starting to pineapple, the leaves curling tight to conserve moisture. It was a sign of extreme stress, and the farmers knew that if rain didn't come within a week, the crop would be lost. Marcus's garden, however, was a different story. He had planted a variety of high-value crops including heirloom melons and deep-rooted peppers. Above ground, the soil looked dry and dusty, but the plants were growing at an incredible rate. He measured the growth of his vines and found they were putting on nearly 4 inches a day. The secret was the constant, steady supply of water at the root zone. There was no evaporation loss and no salt buildup. The community's mockery was starting to be replaced by a quiet, uneasy observation. People would drive slowly past his gate looking for the hidden hose or the secret tank. They couldn't reconcile what they were seeing with what they knew about farming. Silas Thorne came by one afternoon and offered to sell Marcus a diesel pump at cost, saying he felt bad for a man who was working so hard for a doomed crop. Marcus thanked him but declined, saying the pump would only make noise and he preferred the silence. Silas left shaking his head, convinced that Marcus was going to let his pride ruin him. The tension in the county was palpable as the water table continued to drop and the pressure on the municipal system increased. The crisis reached its first peak in late July when a dry lightning storm ignited a fire in the timber on the north side of the county. The air was filled with the smell of wood smoke and the sun looked like a dull red coin in the sky. The fire department was stretched thin and the lack of water pressure made their jobs nearly impossible. Farmers were out in their fields with shovels and wet burlap sacks trying to create fire breaks. Marcus watched from his ridge, feeling a deep sense of dread. He knew that if the fire jumped the road, his farm would be gone in minutes. He realized that his system wasn't just about growing food, it was about resilience and survival. He spent the night on his porch watching the orange glow on the horizon and praying for the first time in years. In the first week of August, the temperature hit an all-time record of 108 degrees. The local newspaper ran a headline that simply read "The Big Burn." It was during this week that the first of Marcus's neighbors truly lost hope. Miller's entire corn crop turned gray and brittle over the course of 48 hours. He walked into the diner, sat down, and put his head in his hands. He had spent 40 years on that land, and he was watching it die in front of his eyes. Marcus heard about Miller's situation and went to visit him. He didn't bring a checkbook or a sympathy card, he brought a crate of the most beautiful moisture-heavy melons Miller had ever seen. He told Miller that the land wasn't dead, it was just thirsty, and that there was a way to fix it for the long term. The build was finally completed in the second week of August. The last pipe was laid and the last joint was sealed. Marcus stood back and looked at his work. From the surface, you couldn't see a thing. The fields looked like any other parched farm in the county. But beneath the surface, 2 miles of terracotta were pulsing with life. He had filled the main cistern to capacity using the last of the ridge top dew and a small amount of water he had saved from the spring runoff. He opened the final gate valve and listened. He didn't hear a motor or a hum. He heard a faint gurgle, a sigh of the earth as the water began its long, slow journey through the clay. He felt a sense of peace that he hadn't known in decades. He had done what he set out to do. The validation came on the 15th of August. A delegation from the State Agricultural University arrived at the farm, having heard rumors of a miracle garden in the middle of a disaster zone. They were led by a professor. Ariswo had spent his life studying irrigation efficiency. Aris was skeptical, but as he walked the rows he began to see the genius of the design. He took soil moisture readings at various depths and his jaw dropped. While the surface was at 5% moisture, the root zone at 18 inches was at a perfect 25%. He looked at Marcus and asked for the blueprints. Marcus handed him a stack of weathered notebooks filled with hand-drawn diagrams and complex equations. Aris spent the next 6 hours poring over the notes, his skepticism turning into profound admiration. The professor told Marcus that he had essentially reinvented the wheel but had made it out of the very dirt it was rolling over. He explained that Marcus's system was achieving a level of efficiency that modern drip irrigation couldn't match because it eliminated the problem of surface tension and soil crusting. The word of the professor's visit spread through the county like the fire had a few weeks earlier. The townspeople began to realize that Henderson wasn't a fool, he was a visionary. The same men who had mocked him at the hardware store now began to show up at his barn door, not with jokes but with hats in their hands. They wanted to know if the system could be scaled. They wanted to know if they could save their own farms before it was too late. The legacy was beginning to take shape before the drought even ended. Marcus spent his evenings teaching his neighbors the art of the pipe. He showed them how to find the right clay and how to build a simple kill. He taught them about the 1.5% grade and the importance of the gravel bedding. He didn't charge them a dime. He said that knowledge shouldn't be sold, it should be shared like a good rain. He saw a community that had been divided by competition and hardship begin to come together around a common goal. They were no longer just farmers, they were becoming hydrologists and engineers. They were taking control of their own destiny. By the end of August, the first of the neighboring farms had begun their own installations. It was a race against time and the elements. They worked together as a collective, pooling their labor and resources. They used Marcus's design as a template but adapted it to their own specific topography. The atmosphere in the county had shifted from one of despair to one of intense, focused activity. The sound of shovels hitting the earth replaced the sound of complaints at the diner. Marcus was everywhere at once, supervising the grades, checking the joints, and encouraging the men who were tired and discouraged. He was the architect of a new way of life. The long-term impact was profound. Within 5 years, Blackwood County became known as the Green Valley. Even during the driest summers, their crops remained lush and productive. The dependence on the municipal water supply dropped by 60%, allowing the town to invest in other infrastructure. The young people who had been leaving the county for jobs in the city began to stay, seeing a future in a new kind of agriculture that was both ancient and high-tech. The Henderson method was featured in national magazines, and Marcus was invited to speak at conferences all over the world. He always gave the same speech, telling them that the answer wasn't in more technology, but in a deeper understanding of the earth we walk on. He would often sit on his porch and look out at the valley. He could see the vent pipes of his neighbors' systems glinting in the sun. He knew that the water was moving down there, silent and relentless. He thought about his grandfather's journal and the ancient engineers of the Levant. He felt like he was part of a long, unbroken chain of human ingenuity. He had proven that we don't have to be victims of the climate if we have the courage to listen to what the land is telling us. He could have retired to a beach. He could have ignored the struggle of his community. He could have kept his secrets to himself, but he didn't. He chose to dig. The final lesson Marcus Henderson left for the world was one of patience. He showed that true innovation doesn't happen overnight. It happens in the quiet hours of the morning, it happens in the heat of a July trench, and it happens in the willingness to fail and try again. He proved that the most powerful systems are often the simplest ones, and that the most valuable resources are the ones we already have beneath our feet. As he grew older, he became a sort of sage for the region, a man who people turned to when things got difficult. He always had the same advice: look at the grade, check the joints, and remember that the water wants to find its way home. The kiln Marcus built behind the old tractor shed became a symbol of his isolation and his resolve. He spent weeks experimenting with different wood types to find the perfect fuel for the fire. He discovered that cured white oak provided the steady, high-temperature heat required to bring the clay to that specific state of semi-vitrification. He needed the pipes to be hard enough to support the weight of the overburden, but porous enough to allow for what he called the slow sweat. He sat by the fire for 36 hours at a time, monitoring the color of the flame through a small mica window. He knew that if the flame turned a certain shade of white, the temperature was too high and the pores in the clay would fuse shut, turning his irrigation pipes into useless glass tubes. If the flames stayed to orange, the clay would remain underfired and would eventually melt back into the earth under the pressure of the groundwater. Silas Thorne came by one evening while Marcus was unloading a batch of cooled pipes. Silas picked one up and tapped it with a pocket knife, listening to the dull ring. He told Marcus that it sounded like a cracked bell and that a man shouldn't put his faith in things that don't ring true. Silas said that the new plastic pipes at the hardware store were guaranteed for 50 years and could be installed in a weekend. He warned Marcus that the labor he was putting into these clay tubes was a form of penance for a crime he hadn't committed. Marcus didn't argue. He just showed Silas the way the clay absorbed a drop of water, pulling it into the walls of the pipe through capillary action. He told Silas that plastic was a barrier, but clay was a bridge. Silas just shook his head and walked back to his truck, convinced that Marcus was working himself into an early grave over a theory that defied the modern world. The second month of the build was defined by the struggle against the topography of the ridge. Marcus had to calculate the head pressure of the system without the aid of a computer. He used a series of clear plastic hoses filled with dyed water to establish a perfect level across the uneven terrain. He discovered that the land had subtle dips and swells that weren't visible to the naked eye but would cause air pockets to form in his lines. To solve this, he designed a series of automatic air relief valves. These were essentially small terracotta chambers containing a hollowed-out sphere of cork. When air entered the chamber, the cork would drop, allowing the air to escape. When the water returned, the cork would float back up and seal the vent. It was a design he had seen in an old textbook on Victorian city planning, adapted for a rural farm. The labor was relentless. Marcus was moving an average of 2 tons of earth every day by hand. He developed a rhythm that allowed him to work through the heat of the afternoon, a steady back and forth movement that minimized the strain on his joints. He could have rented a backhoe for a week and finished the trenches in a fraction of the time. He could have hired the high school kids looking for summer work to do the heavy lifting. He could have used a standard trencher that would have cut a clean line through the shale, but he didn't. He felt that he needed to touch every foot of the trench to feel the moisture content of the soil and to understand the specific geology of each row. He was building a relationship with the land that couldn't be achieved through the controls of a machine. By the time he reached the 3rd acre, the soil changed from silt to a heavy, iron-rich clay that stuck to his shovel like wet cement. This was the most difficult section. The drainage was poor and the risk of the pipes settling unevenly was high. Marcus had to create a specialized bedding using a mixture of wood ash and fine sand. The ash acted as a natural fungicide, preventing the roots of the surrounding trees from seeking out the moisture in the pipes and eventually cracking the joints. He spent his nights grinding charcoal into a fine powder to add to the mix. His neighbors saw the black dust on his clothes and the dark smudges on his face and whispered that he was practicing some kind of agrarian alchemy. They didn't understand that he was building a biological filter that would keep his system clean for a century. The pressure-regulating cistern at the top of the ridge was the masterpiece of the entire network. It was a circular chamber, 10 feet deep and 12 feet across, lined with a double layer of brick and sealed with a hydraulic lime mortar. Marcus had designed the intake to be a series of stone-filled galleries that would catch the subsurface flow from the high woods. This meant that even in a dry spell, the system would still be gathering the hidden moisture that moved through the deep strata of the hill. He installed a gauge made from a simple brass rod and a wooden float so he could monitor the water level from a distance. The neighbors called it Henderson's Well of Silence because there was never the sound of a pump or the splash of a fountain. It just sat there, a quiet stone sentinel overlooking the valley. As the build progressed into the third month, the weather began to take a turn for the worse. The expected spring rains never materialized. The sky stayed a hard, polished gray that offered no relief. The wind began to blow from the west, a hot, dry breath that sucked the moisture out of everything it touched. The dust on the gravel roads became so thick that it looked like a layer of snow. The older farmers in the county began to talk about the drought of 1956, comparing the cracks in the earth to the ones they remembered from their childhood. They watched the horizon with a desperate intensity, looking for any sign of a thunderhead. The crisis began in earnest when the Blackwood Creek stopped flowing. This was the primary water source for half the farms in the county. Usually, the creek was a roaring torrent in May, but this year it had dwindled to a series of stagnant pools filled with dying minnows. The farmers who relied on surface pumps found their intakes sucking mud. They had to haul water in tanks from the city, a process that was expensive and labor-intensive. Silas Thorne's hardware store ran out of garden hoses and plastic barrels in a matter of days. The price of hay began to skyrocket as the pastures turned brown and the cattle began to lose weight. Marcus, however, was in the final stages of connecting his lateral lines. He was working 12-hour days to get the system online before the heat became terminal for his crops. He was exhausted, his body lean and hard from the months of manual labor. He had lost 20 pounds, and his skin was the color of a walnut. He watched as his neighbors struggled, their faces etched with worrying and fatigue. He saw Miller standing by the dry creek bed, looking at the cracked mud with an expression of pure heartbreak. Miller had 40 acres of corn that was already starting to wither. It was only knee-high, and the leaves were turning a sickly yellow. The heat intensified. By the middle of June, the temperature was consistently hitting 95 degrees by 10 o'clock in the morning. The air was so dry that it felt like it was pulling the moisture directly out of your eyes. The birds stopped singing, and the only sound in the afternoon was the dry rattle of the wind through the dead grass. It was during this time that Marcus finally opened the main valve of the cistern. He did it quietly, without any fanfare. He just turned the heavy iron wheel and listened. He could hear the water entering the main line, a faint, distant hum that vibrated through the soles of his boots. He walked down to the first row of his garden and knelt in the dust. He waited. About 20 minutes later, he saw it. A small, dark circle of moisture began to appear around the base of a tomato plant. It wasn't a puddle. It was a subtle darkening of the soil, as if the earth were breathing out a cool mist. He moved to the next row and saw the same thing. The subterranean pipes were working exactly as he had calculated. They were sweating moisture into the root zone, bypassing the scorched surface and the thirsty air. He dug down a few inches with his fingers and felt the soil. It was cool and damp, a stark contrast to the burning heat of the surface. He felt a surge of relief that almost brought him to his knees. The months of labor, the ridicule from the town, and the physical toll on his body had been worth it. While the rest of the county was watching their dreams turn to dust, Marcus's farm began to transform. His plants didn't just survive, they thrived. The tomato vines grew thick and dark green, their leaves heavy with the promise of fruit. The peppers and squash began to spread across the mulch, creating a lush carpet of life in the middle of a wasteland. From the road, it looked like a mirage. People would stop their trucks and stare, unable to understand how a man could have such a garden when the sky was a desert. They looked for the hidden pipes, the secret pumps, the illegal siphons. They saw nothing but Marcus out in his field with a hoe, a quiet smile on his face. The tension in the community reached a boiling point in late June. A group of farmers, led by Silas Thorne, demanded that the county sheriff investigate Marcus for water theft. They were convinced that he must be tapping into the main town line or using an unregistered deep well. The sheriff, a man named Miller's nephew, arrived at the farm with a warrant and a team of technicians. They spent 2 days searching the property using ground-penetrating radar and moisture sensors. They checked every inch of the perimeter, looking for any connection to the municipal system. They found nothing. What they did find was a network of clay pipes that didn't show up on any modern map and a cistern that was filled with nothing but collected dew and subsurface seepage. The sheriff sat on Marcus's porch after the investigation was over, drinking a glass of cold water that Marcus had pulled from his stone-lined pantry. He told Marcus that the people in town were scared and that fear makes people do foolish things. He said that when a man has a green field while his neighbor has a graveyard, it's only natural for the neighbor to look for a villain. Marcus didn't hold a grudge. He told the sheriff that he wasn't a villain, he was just a man who knew how to listen to the hill. He offered the sheriff a basket of fresh greens to take home to his wife. The sheriff accepted them, his eyes wide at the quality of the produce. He told Marcus that he'd never seen anything like it in 30 years of law enforcement. The drought continued into July and the situation became desperate. The town's reservoir dropped to 20% capacity, and the water board announced that all non-essential water use was strictly prohibited. This meant no more watering gardens, no more washing cars, and no more filling livestock troughs. The heat was relentless, a physical force that seemed to be trying to crush the spirit of the county. The elderly were being moved into the high school gym because it was the only building with functioning air conditioning. The local hospital was struggling to keep its cooling towers running. It was then that the first fire broke out. It started in a dry pasture on the edge of town, likely from a discarded cigarette or a spark from a passing train. Within minutes, the wind had picked up the flames and pushed them into the timber. The local fire department was overwhelmed. They didn't have the water pressure to fight a blaze of that size, and the forest was a tinderbox. The smoke filled the valley, a thick, acrid haze that made it difficult to breathe. The orange glow on the horizon was a constant reminder of the fragility of their existence. Marcus watched the fire from his ridge. He knew that if the wind shifted, his farm would be directly in the path of the flames. He didn't panic. He had designed his system for this exact scenario. He went to the cistern and opened a secondary valve that fed into a series of perimeter lines. These lines weren't for irrigation, they were for fire suppression. They were buried deeper and designed to saturate a 30-foot wide strip of land around the entire property. Within hours, the perimeter of Marcus's farm was a wet, muddy moat. While the surrounding grass was dry enough to ignite from a single spark, Marcus's land was a damp sanctuary. The fire eventually turned away, driven by a lucky shift in the wind, but the damage was done. Thousands of acres of timber were gone, and 3 homes on the edge of town had been destroyed. The community was in shock. They gathered at the Grange Hall to discuss what to do next. The mood was somber, a mix of grief and anger. Silas Thorne stood up and said that they couldn't keep living like this, waiting for a rain that never came. He looked at Marcus, who was sitting in the back of the room, and asked him to stand up. He didn't ask it as a challenge, he asked it as a plea. Silas told the room that they had all been fools to laugh at Marcus and that it was time they learned how he did it. Marcus stood up and walked to the front of the room. He didn't have a prepared speech. He just told them about the terracotta pipes and the 1.5% grade. He told them about the sweat of the clay and the memory of the Moroccan valleys. He told them that the earth wasn't their enemy, but their partner. He explained that they didn't need 1 million gallons of water to grow a crop. They just needed the right amount of water in the right place at the right time. He offered to show anyone who was willing to listen how to build their own system. He told them that he would provide the clay from his own deposit and the use of his kiln for free. The following morning, there was a line of trucks at Marcus's gate. Men who hadn't spoken to him in years were there with shovels and notebooks. They spent the next month working under Marcus's direction, learning the art of the subterranean sweat. They built kins in their own backyards and dug trenches by hand. The mockery was gone, replaced by a desperate, focused energy. They were no longer fighting each other for the last of the creek water. They were working together to harvest the hidden moisture of the earth. The validation of Marcus's method wasn't just in the survival of the crops, it was in the survival of the community. By the end of the summer, 12 other farms had installed the basic elements of the Henderson system. When the first rains finally came in late September, they were greeted not just with relief, but with a new understanding. The farmers watched as the water soaked into their land, no longer running off into the ditches, but being pulled deep into the earth, where it would be stored in their new terracotta networks. They had learned that resilience isn't about having the most resources. It's about having the most wisdom. The legacy of that summer was a transformation of Blackwood County. The Henderson method became a point of pride for the region. Agricultural experts from across the country came to study the miracle of the dry ridge. They were amazed by the simplicity and the efficiency of the design. They found that the terracotta pipes actually improved the soil structure over time, encouraging the growth of beneficial microbes and fungi that couldn't survive in the traditional, chemically treated fields. The farm was no longer an industrial site, it was a living, breathing ecosystem. Marcus Henderson lived another 20 years, and in that time, he saw his methods spread to dozens of other counties and even to other states. He never patented his design and never charged for his advice. He believed that the earth belongs to everyone and that the knowledge of how to care for it should be free. He spent his final years sitting on his porch, watching the valley turn green every spring. He knew that the water was moving down there, silent and steady, a hidden pulse that would keep the land alive long after he was gone. He had proven that one man with a shovel and a dream could change the course of history, not by force, but by understanding. The story of the man who buried pipes became a local legend, a tale told to children about the importance of looking beneath the surface. It was a reminder that when the world is loud and the heat is unbearable, the best answers are often the quietest ones. Marcus Henderson didn't just grow tomatoes, he grew hope. He showed a town that was dying of thirst that the water they were looking for was right beneath their feet, waiting for someone with the patience to find it. He was the man who planted the water, and in doing so, he harvested a future for everyone. The scientific community began to take notice of the Blackwood miracle in a way that Marcus never anticipated. It wasn't just about the water anymore, it was about the biology of the soil. When Marcus had buried those pipes, he hadn't just created an irrigation system, he had created a massive subterranean thermal regulator. In the winter, the water in the pipes held the residual heat of the deep earth, preventing the ground from freezing as solid as the surrounding fields. In the summer, the cool water from the aquifer acted as a heat sink, pulling the scorching thermal energy away from the delicate root systems. This created a consistent temperature zone that allowed for the growth of beneficial mycorrhizal fungi which normally perished in the extreme temperature fluctuations of traditional top-down farming. Marcus started receiving letters from researchers at universities as far away as California and Israel. They wanted to know the exact micron size of the pores in his terracotta. They wanted to know the specific gravity of the water column in his cistern. Marcus would sit at his kitchen table and answer every letter with a fountain pen. He told them that the math was simple, but the observation was hard. He explained that most modern engineers were trying to force the earth to behave a certain way, while he was simply providing the earth with the tools to behave naturally. He wrote about the osmotic potential of the silt loam and how the clay pipes acted as an artificial vein system mimicking the way a tree draws moisture from the deep strata. The legacy of the build began to manifest in the local economy in ways no one had predicted. Because the Henderson method required no electricity and very little maintenance, the farmers in Blackwood County suddenly found themselves with a significant surplus of capital. They weren't spending $30,000 a year on diesel for their pumps or on the constant repair of pressurized plastic lines that cracked in the frost. This extra money stayed in the county. The local school got a new library and the town square was revitalized. The community that had once been on the brink of bankruptcy was now a model of rural prosperity. And at the center of it all was the man who had spent a summer digging in the dirt. By the mid-2000s, Marcus had taken on an apprentice, a young veteran named Caleb, who had returned from overseas looking for a way to ground himself. Caleb was haunted by the noise of the world, and he found a profound peace in the silence of the Henderson farm. Marcus taught him how to listen to the pipes. He showed him how a slight change in the pitch of the air vents could signal a blockage or a shift in the water table. They spent their mornings walking the lines, checking the stone filters and the copper mesh traps. Marcus told Caleb that the land doesn't ask for much, but it demands your attention. He said that a man who can't hear the earth won't ever be able to feed it. One afternoon, a representative from a major international irrigation corporation drove up the long gravel driveway in a sleek black SUV. He was wearing a suit that cost more than Marcus's tractor, and he carried a leather briefcase filled with legal documents. He offered Marcus a staggering sum of money for the exclusive patents to the Henderson sweat pipe design. He talked about global distribution and high-efficiency manufacturing. He said they could replace the hand-pressed terracotta with a high-tech synthetic polymer that would last forever. Marcus listened to the pitch with a quiet patience, then he walked the man out to the kill. He picked up a piece of the local clay and crumbled it in his hand. He told the executive that the reason the system worked was because it was made of the same material it was buried in. He said that a plastic pipe from a factory in another state didn't have a soul and it didn't have a relationship with the Blackwood soil. He refused the offer. He could have been a millionaire 10 times over. He could have seen his name on a corporate logo in every farm supply store in the country. He could have retired to a life of luxury and never touched a shovel again, but he didn't. He told the man that you can't patent the rain and you shouldn't patent the way it moves through the ground. The legacy spread not through corporate catalogs, but through word of mouth and small-scale community projects. Marcus and Caleb traveled to the Appalachian foothills and the arid plains of the Southwest, helping families install their own gravity-fed systems. They saw the same pattern repeated everywhere they went. Initial skepticism followed by a period of hard labor, and then the quiet miracle of a green field in a dry year. Marcus began to see the world as a network of hidden veins waiting to be reconnected. He believed that the path to true independence for the American farmer wasn't through bigger machines, but through smaller, more resilient systems. As Marcus entered his late 70s, his body finally began to slow down, but his mind remained as sharp as a laser level. He spent more time on the porch reflecting on the philosophical implications of his life's work. He realized that the greatest challenge of the modern age was the loss of the connection between the human hand and the earth. He saw how the reliance on automated systems had made men fragile and disconnected from the rhythms of the seasons. He wanted his legacy to be more than just a plumbing trick. He wanted it to be a return to a way of being that was both humble and powerful. The technical data from the farm over 25 years was eventually compiled into a landmark study by the State University. The results were undeniable. The Henderson method used 90% less water than traditional overhead irrigation and 64% less than high-end drip systems. The crop yields were 20% higher on average, with a significantly higher nutrient density because the plants weren't being stressed by the cycle of wilting and flooding. The soil organic matter on the Henderson farm had tripled since the system was installed. It was a complete reversal of the trend of soil depletion that was plaguing the rest of the Midwest. The transition of the farm to the next generation was a moment of profound significance for Blackwood. On Marcus's 80th birthday, the town held a festival in his honor. They didn't call it a retirement party because they knew Marcus would never truly stop working. They called it the Festival of the Living Earth. People came from all over the state bringing baskets of produce that had been grown using his methods. There were heirloom tomatoes the size of softballs and peppers that shone like rubies. Silas Thorne, now an old man himself, stood up and gave a speech that brought the whole room to tears. He apologized for every joke he had ever made, and he thanked Marcus for saving the town from itself. The legacy of the buried pipes was also a legacy of architecture. Marcus had shown that a farm shouldn't be a flat industrial landscape, but a three-dimensional living structure. He had designed his system to work with the natural drainage patterns of the hill, using the excess runoff from the spring thaw to recharge the deep soil reservoirs. This meant that the farm acted as a massive sponge, preventing the flash flooding that often devastated the lower valley. The local government began to incorporate his principles into their regional water management plans, citing the Henderson Farm as the primary reason the county's infrastructure was so resilient. In his final years, Marcus focused on the concept of intergenerational hydrology. He wanted to ensure that the system he had built would last for centuries. He worked with Caleb to map every joint and vent in a massive ledger made of archival paper. They used traditional surveying techniques and modern GPS to create a permanent record of the subterranean network. Marcus believed that as long as the map existed, the farm would never die. He taught the local school children how to make their own terracotta pipes, showing them the magic of turning mud into a tool for life. He saw the wonder in their eyes, and he knew that the secret was safe. The profound lesson of Marcus Henderson's life was that innovation doesn't always look like progress. Sometimes it looks like a step backward into the wisdom of the past. He showed that the most complex problems of the 21st century, drought, climate instability, and resource depletion, could be addressed by returning to the fundamental laws of physics and biology. He proved that a man's worth isn't measured by the power of his engine, but by the depth of his understanding. He lived a life of quiet defiance against the cult of the new, showing that what is truly modern is what is truly sustainable. As the sun set on his final summer, Marcus sat in his favorite chair on the ridge. He could feel the cool air rising from the vents of his system, a gentle breath of the earth that he had helped to facilitate. He looked out over a valley that was green and vibrant even as a heat wave shimmered on the horizon. He thought about the miles of pipe he had laid, the thousands of joints he had sealed, and the millions of gallons of water that had moved through his land without a single watt of electricity. He felt a deep sense of completion. He had planted the water, and it had grown into a legacy that would feed the world long after his shovel was put away for good. He could have been a footnote in the history of a dying town. He could have been a cautionary tale about the dangers of obsession. He could have lived a life of ease and ignored the thirst of the land. But he didn't. He chose the shovel. He chose the clay. And in doing so, he chose to give the future a way to survive. The man who was mocked for burying tubes under his garden became the man who showed us how to live in harmony with the hidden forces of our world. As the stars began to appear over Blackwood, the silent heartbeat of the earth continued its steady pulse below the surface, a rhythm of water and gravity that would never stop.